Take your seats now. May I please introduce the Lord Mayor's Aldermanic Representative, Alderman Prem Goyal.
Good evening, honoured guests. A very warm welcome to Guildhall, the historic home of the City of London, for this special event to celebrate a new home for the Migration Museum. I am Alderman Prem Goyal, and I am honoured to be representing the Lord Mayor this evening. We at the City of London Corporation are delighted that the Migration Museum is moving to a permanent home right here in the square mile at 65 Friars. The City Corporation has always proudly supported cultural and educational spaces, museums, libraries, and art venues. They are of immense importance to our communities and help make the square mile a more vibrant, welcoming place as part of the Destination City program. And as this week is Mental Health Awareness Week, it's a good time to remember how places like museums can have a positive impact on our well-being. Migration has always been a huge part of the City of London story. We cannot understand the city without understanding migration. This museum is a great asset for the square mile on the doorstep of London's East End, and we are thrilled to welcome it. Tonight, we are fortunate to have an exceptional panel here to discuss the art of belonging, migration meets culture in a changing UK. Afterwards, we can continue the discussion over drinks. But first, it's my great pleasure to introduce the Chief Executive of the Migration Museum, Sophie Henderson.
Well, thank you so much, Prem, for that incredibly warm welcome. And thank you to the Corporation of London for hosting us here in these absolutely magnificent surroundings. I'm going to hand you over to our incredible panel in a moment. And I have to say, when I emailed each of the panellists to ask if they would take part today, and they all said yes. I simply couldn't believe my luck. So I think we're in for a real treat. Before handing over, I'd just like to say a few words about the Migration Museum. And before that, I'd like to show you a short film just to give you a little flavour, which I think can more eloquently explain the kind of substance of what we do. So I think we'll have a look at the film first.
Migration is the story of our time. It's the story of Britain. It's the story of all of us. The Migration Museum brings these stories to life through exhibitions, events, learning and community programs. The museum explores how the movement of people to and from these shores throughout the years has shaped us as individuals, as communities and as nations.
What's exciting about working at the Migration Museum is that we get to really create a different kind of museum, one that's genuinely participatory. Everything we do at the museum brings in hundreds of collaborators, whether they're artists or people who have their own personal migration stories to tell. I think that's really at the heart of it, and it's not about just facts and figures, but it's about those human stories.
Here to the right here, that's my mother, Clarice Agatha Reid. The label people call them is the Windrush generation, but I just call them amazing people, super people really, essentially.
And I think also we have a very imaginative approach to how we do things. You know, we're not just a museum of objects in glass cases, we're a museum that's very alive. And I think lastly I would say that we're a museum that cuts against the grain a bit. You know, we won't just tell you a straight up history of migration, but we really make it relevant to the present moment and give the context for the kind of debates that are happening and shed light on stories in a surprising way.
I think the fact that so many different narratives and experiences are represented is really beautiful. It goes from the real difficult moments of displacement and migration to the really incredible moments, and I think it represents the nuance of lived experience of being a migrant or being a refugee or being a displaced person really poignantly.
The moment I stepped into the Migration Museum, I met a lady there who was just so welcoming. It was like, you want to be a part of something special, and this is what I felt.
We've got an incredible learning team, hugely skilled in facilitating, what can be really sort of complex and difficult conversations, actually. I think their special skill is in helping people to have these sometimes difficult conversations, but in a way that is intense and serious and enjoyable. Children really ask the trickiest questions and they really want answers.
What I find most compelling, I guess, is having those moments and finding ways to get students to personally connect with this topic. It's a topic that they almost all have heard about before in different ways, but I think it's quite a distant topic most of the time. Whether that's something they're learning about in history or at home, or in the news, it's quite distant. So I do like to find those ways to bring it back down, make it personal and relevant.
If one or more of your grandparents was born in a different country, so not in England.
My grandma on my dad's side was born in Germany, and both my grandparents on my mum's side were born in Nigeria.
Please take a very, 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 very small step if you would like to move to a different country or explore another culture one day.
I've found that it's been a really amazing addition to our children's learning, and you guys really can do things that are not easy for us to do at school.
We have been doing these walking tours since 2016. Here in the City of London, the stories of migration are all around us. They are told through the place names, through the buildings. We will be walking along the same routes that Roman Londoners, medieval Saxon Londoners and Vikings would have walked. We can highlight how Flemish weavers, followed by Huguenot weavers, had kind of made an impact on the surrounding area and changed the very fabric and shape of Britain and British culture that we have today.
We have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to create Britain's Missing Museum, a permanent migration museum in the City of London, a space for everyone to explore, question and celebrate who we are.
Let's make this vision a reality. Support the Migration Museum, share your story and be part of something bigger.
That's given you a little bit of a flavour of some of the things that we've been doing over the last 10 years or so from a series of temporary homes, mostly recently in a beautiful home in a former H&M store in Lewisham Shopping Centre where we have been for the last 5 years. We've only just had to move out of there. And in that space, we've welcomed 80,000 visitors a year. We put on eight exhibitions. We've grown our learning programme. You saw quite a lot about the learning programme there, but it won a prestigious award last year, which was the Charity Awards, the best learning programme on grounds that it was both innovative and scalable. We've done digital work that has taken our campaigns to 12 million people, notably in relation to the England football Euros men's competition, looking at what the starting lineup would look like without first or second generation immigration. It turns out not very many players left. So we've done a number of amazing things, including building the partnerships that we require to bring home this permanent museum. Because a permanent home, poetic and attractive though it is in many ways, the idea of being a peripatetic migrating museum for a migrating migration museum, it's actually not very practical, but actually we think that nothing less will do than a permanent home to give dignity and prominence to this important British story and put it right at centre stage where it belongs. And of course it means having a permanent home that we can achieve much bigger impact. And this is what we can do in the city. We can welcome 140,000 visitors a year. We can reach 80,000 school children through direct visits to the museum and indirectly through teacher training. We can reach millions digitally, and we can achieve a national footprint. And I think this is exciting to get the story outside London and to different audiences, beyond the capital. We can do pop-ups in shopping centres and high streets all over the UK. And we've piloted this. We know it works. We piloted it, extensively in Lewisham, but also in Leeds Trinity Shopping Centre. So a London museum, but with a national footprint. And all of this, is what we're going to bring to the city, and we cannot wait. So it's so exciting that this museum is literally now taking shape. You saw the core of the building has gone up, and we're just kind of watching it rise. It'll be ready for us to move into in early 2028, and we cannot think of a more appropriate place for it to be than right in the heart of our capital city. And we have to thank for this opportunity a remarkable man. He's the founder of the property company Dominus that's putting this building up. He's someone who arrived in Britain as a refugee 53 years ago. His name is Supal Alawalia. He was one of the East African Asians who were expelled from Idi Amin's Uganda. They were told they had to get out in 90 days with a suitcase and £5. So he arrived in this country with absolutely nothing, spent the first few months here in a refugee camp on Greenham Common. And from those beginnings, he has become one of Britain's most successful entrepreneurs. So this is an incredible story and an amazing enabling partnership for the museum. We have a lot to do between opening our doors between now and opening our doors in 2028, not least raising the capital sum that we require to fit out the museum. But I'm incredibly thrilled to be able to announce that we have today our inaugural naming donor, and that's the Portal Trust, who have £500,000 put their name on one of our education spaces within our learning suite. We're looking for partners, we're looking for sponsors, and now is absolutely the most exciting and interesting time to be involved with us. So if this excites you and interests you, please get in touch. I think we need a migration museum more now than ever before. Migration is obviously a talked about topic. I think today, possibly more talked about than ever before. It can be polarising, and it can be a subject we don't talk about particularly well. We also can talk about migration really well. But I think the Migration Museum can be that place, that conversational space for good conversations about migration to happen. We want to illuminate this great, rich, important story, which is all around us, in plain sight, if only we put the right glasses on. It's in the language we speak, and the food we eat, and the shops we frequent, the institutions that we cherish, like the National Health Service, like the Royal Family. These are big, important migration stories. And we can do this in a place that's beautiful and welcoming and friendly and vibrant and stimulating, and using a tone of voice that isn't preachy, that isn't messagey, but is really quite enjoyable and playful. Our premise is that each of us, without exception, has a migration story. And this is in danger of sounding a little trite, but I think it's profound and it's true that whoever you are, if you dig back into your family history, you will have a story of migration, whether of immigration or emigration, somewhere in your past. And I think using these connections to bring us together, not divide us, on the topic of migration is what our museum can do. So thank you very much for hearing a little bit about the Migration Museum. We can't wait to be in the city, and it just remains for me to hand you over to our wonderful panel, chaired by Reeta Chakrabarti, who you will all know extremely well for the distinguished journalist that she is, and the anchor of BBC 1 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 10 o'clock news. And also, she has managed somehow to write a novel, her debut novel, which was published last week. So that's an exciting time for all of us. I haven't managed to read it yet. It's called Finding Belle. And Rose Tremaine, no less, has said it's a gripping story of family betrayal, full of passion and anger, moving and memorable. So I can't wait to read it. Thank you so much to Reeta and all the panel, and welcome.
Sophie, thank you very much for that very unexpected plug for my novel. I wasn't at all expecting it, and I will come back again if you keep doing things like that. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here this evening to be chairing this very important session, and thank you for coming. You could be outside having a nice glass of wine in the sunshine. There will be wine later on, I promise you, and you will be invigorated by our discussion. As Sophie said, migration, and specifically immigration, is constantly in the news. But I am taking a day away from the newsroom today, and I want to set aside the politics tonight, set aside the debate about economic benefits or not, and focus very much on Britain as she is today, a rich, diverse nation with a multiplicity of peoples, and look at what that has done to our culture, our ways we express ourselves. And by culture, we will be talking about the arts, but also writing and about history, really about all expressions of thought. And whether, if that has changed, how that changes our sense of ourselves. So questions we'll be discussing will include: what should the role of arts and culture be? Should it merely reflect what's around us? Is it to catalyse conversations and debate? Or is it to actively attempt to lead and change people's minds? We have a wonderful panel tonight, who I'll introduce in a moment. The way we're going to run this is each of our panel members will speak for a couple of minutes about their field of work. Then I'll be talking to them. We'll be in conversation, although I'll be talking to you individually. Please do cut across each other and contribute and so on. And then that'll go on for about 45 minutes. And then I will throw the floor open to questions. So if you've got questions, please do keep them and don't be shy. So I'm going to go from that end. We have Indhu Rubasingham, who's just arrived as the Artistic Director of the National Theatre, where her appointment has prompted great excitement and anticipation. She comes from the Kiln Theatre in Kilburn, where she was Artistic Director since 2012. Devlin is an artist and stage designer who's worked in a range of media. She's won 3 Tonys and 3 Oliviers for her theatre set designs and has created numerous installations based on collective and community experiences. I think she very much wants to speak about one of those in particular. Sathnam Sanghera, journalist and writer. He's a columnist and feature writer for The Times, and he's written a memoir, a novel, and 3 books on empire. So he can turn his hand to any sort of writing. And then David Olusoga, who you will know from the small screen, historian, writer and broadcaster. He's also Professor of Public History at Manchester University and a trustee of the Migration Museum. So I wonder if I can start with you, Indhu, and just get you to talk for a couple of minutes about yourself, about your work.
Okay. Hi. It's really nice to be here. So my name's Indhu. My parents came my father came in the 60s from Sri Lanka. Both my parents are from Sri Lanka, Tamil Sri Lankan. And my father came here he trained as a doctor and came here to specialise. He was always going to move back. Went back, married my mum, came over in the 70s, and me and my brother were born here and in Sheffield. And we were always, he wanted us to have the best of both worlds. And we were literally about to move back in 1982. We didn't, but luckily we didn't, because in 1983 a civil war in Sri Lanka broke out. I was sort of archetypally very good at sciences at school, and through a really brilliant opportunity at school where I got work experience to go into my local theatre, I got the theatre bug. I then did a drama degree, and that's what started my career. So I never wanted to be an artistic director. I've said it twice in the press. Yeah. And I wanted to be a pure artist. Anyway, I did become an artistic director in 2012. It was the Tricycle Theatre that then became the Kiln Theatre. I then wanted to stop and travel and go back to freelance, and then the opportunity to apply for the National came up, and I'm quite delusional in the sense that I'm going to go for this and decide through the process. Never believe anyone who tells you to do that, because you end up going through the process and convincing yourself through going through the process that you want the job. I was appointed just over December last year, 23, and my application, the thing that I put in my application was about bringing the world to the National Theatre and taking the National Theatre to the world, and expanding on that. and I just announced my first season last week. And what I talk about, what I'm very interested in, is what I'm calling, through talking to a journalist. I was telling a journalist about what a friend of mine, and I was talking about the shows that I was programming, and she said it's the modern mainstream, and so I have adopted that and saying that what I want the National to represent and explore is what I'm calling the modern mainstream. And by that, I mean it's the most eclectic range of stories and narratives that come from and are about and should attract as many different communities as possible. So, and what does that mainstream now comprise of? And it comprises of many different people. So I think
that wonderful introduction. Stop there, because I'm going to ask you more questions about it in just a second. Ez.
Oh, do you mind? I'm going to stand up, actually, just because I've got a thing about sightlines.
Oh, yeah.
If I can't see your face, I think you, because I'm a bit short, I think you can't see my face. So if you're at the back, can you see me? Can you hear me? All right, cool. So my name's Ez, and I'm a set designer and an artist. And I want to just tell you a bit about one project that I worked on last year. It was actually with Shazia, who's sitting there in the audience. Shazia, go, stand up.
Yeah.
Shazia's shy, but there she is. Oh. Shazia's from the UK for UNHCR, United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And Shazia and some of her colleagues approached me in 2023, or 2022 actually, when I had been working on a project. I was invited to make a project to celebrate Londoners. And it could have been anything really, but I thought I would begin by celebrating the community of Londoners that I didn't know at all, which in that year, 2022, were the more than human species. So I went to the London Wildlife Trust and I said, how many species of Londoner are there? And they said there are 15,000 species of Londoners. Did everyone know that? Is that more or less than you thought? It's more than I thought. And I had thought that I would draw every species. And then when it was 15,000, yeah, exactly, thank you for your sympathy. I was like, no, I can't do that. So I drew 243 of the most endangered of Londoners who were part of my community who I didn't know. And they were strangers to me, but by the end of 4 months of drawing, I felt I had encountered more of my own community. And while I was making these drawings, something happened to me in that I became more aware of my own continuity. The veins on the back of my hand felt continuous with the veins on the back of a bat's wing. And the scales on the back of my hand felt continuous with the scales on the back of a lizard. And the way that my knuckles were shaped felt continuous with the shape of the knuckle of a bird's wing. I felt continuous. And right in the middle of those drawings, I felt a new porosity in our city and in our whole country towards refugees from Ukraine, because it was the time where the invasion had happened. I had made a donation to UNHCR and they called me and said, would you consider working with us? And it took a while to think about the best way to work with UNHCR. And it came to me, I had visited Lucian Freud's sketchbooks at the National Portrait Gallery. And as the conservator turned the pages, I saw these faces emerge out, made out of chalk and charcoal. And I happened to have a meeting that day with the UNHCR UK. And it came to me while I was cycling along the Strand, which I later found out is, of course, a great processional passage, a sort of historic passage of migration in our city. And I thought, what if I ask UNHCR if I can make a series of portraits of their community, of our community, of those who bring their gifts to London. And we said, okay, let's do a portrait project. And I had cycled past the beautiful church of St. Mary le Strand outside Somerset House. And I went and sat in it and I thought about the Magi, I thought about three kings bringing their gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh. And I was looking for a new word because the word refugee at the time felt to me like it was being done a disservice in the way that it was being used. So I said, what if I start to use the phrase, those who bring their gifts? So each person who was brought to me by a UNHCR team, 50 people, arrived one by one at my door of my studio in South London. I only knew their first name And they sat across from me for 45 minutes. We listened to the Max Richter Four Seasons, and I looked straight into their eyes for 45 minutes, and they looked at me, and no words were spoken. There were no words. It was an encounter of one face to another, a face-to-face encounter, sustained over 45 minutes, and I made a drawing. And each person held an empty gift, and they co-authored the work. They told me what they wanted drawn in their gift. And then the drawings were printed out, larger than life, 50 of them arranged in the church. And people came, a lot of people came. I think about 1 million people saw it in the end on social media. But it was queues around the block to get in. We then transferred a smaller version to Somerset House. And the stories that I later recorded from each person after I'd had this non-verbal encounter were relayed in their voices. And really, I think what it evoked, and what I'd be really interested to talk about in terms of what can be done at this museum, was a sense of solidarity, continuity between those who came and felt continuous with this community. Just felt like, this is me, this is us, this is who we are. And that's really what the project was and what I'm excited about this museum.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sathnam.
It feels like doing a video for an arranged marriage. I'm not going to stand up. I'm Sathnam Sanghera. I'm the son of Punjabi immigrants who arrived in Wolverhampton in the late 1960s. Importantly, to do the hard labour in the factories that there weren't enough British people to do. That's a point that gets forgotten in the politics. The narrative is always, oh, they came here uninvited. We had a totally uncontroversial MP at the time called Enoch Powell. Very brand man, didn't say much. He wanted to be Viceroy of India, didn't become Viceroy of India because India became independent. He ended up, ironically, the head of a constituency which had been transformed by migration from empire. And people forget that, he made that speech in 1968, the one I'm on about. My parents arrived in 1968, and people forget that speech was very specifically about the Sikhs. People like my parents and me. And at the time, the Sikhs were engaged in a campaign for the right to wear turbans whilst working on buses. And he was arguing, saying that, this kind of provocation was an indication of what would happen to Britain. It would lead to communalism, it would lead to the failure to integrate, it would lead to rivers of blood and the failure of Britain. And I think he wasn't right. I don't know if that's political. It probably is.
No.
And he was right because arguably I've integrated too much. I write for the Times. I ended up doing a degree in English at Cambridge. So that's where he was worried about happening, I guess. I've dealt with all these themes in all my work. My first book, The Boy with the Top Knot, was about, I guess, some of the problems you get with migration, which I think we need to acknowledge. My novel, Marriage Material, it's not on at the National, unfortunately. It's on at the Hammersmith Lyric in the next few weeks. It's specifically about the turban dispute that was happening in the late 60s, and it traces that time to now, because as we see in the news, I think that speech is probably the most important political speech of our lifetimes. And now I've written 4 books about the British Empire, and we forget not only that immigrants from empire came here invited, that in 1948 the Nationality Act made the people in the Windrush British citizens, but we also forget that the British probably migrated more than any other people in the history of the world. And yes, I guess those are my themes.
Lovely. Thank you. David.
So I'm David Olusoga. I'm an historian. It seems we spend a lot of time sort of justifying talking about emigration and immigration. It seems very odd to feel any sort of defensiveness about it when talking from the Guildhall. We are on the site of the Roman amphitheatre. That was quite a migration, and a fundamental one that founded many of our cities, that is at the centre of our history. And in some ways that speaks to the sort of the banality of stories of immigration and emigration, because it is such a fundamental aspect of British history. The oddity about Britain is, in some ways, the great question about Britain is, how did this small island build the biggest empire the world has ever seen. We seem very often, from the work I do as an historian, to have to sort of remind ourselves that the big question, the big story about Britain is that story of immigration and emigration. There are many bizarre, astonishing, almost unbelievable facts about the British Empire. Perhaps the most amazing and perhaps the most forgotten is that between Waterloo in 1815 and the Western Front in late 1914, 22 million people left Britain and Ireland to go to the Empire, to North America, to other parts of the world. Britain is the great exporter, these islands, I should say, not just Britain, the great exporter of people, but also the great importer. 6 million people, 10% of the population, are, whether they're active or not, have the right to Irish citizenship. Sadly, I'm not one of them. I did look after Brexit. I seem to be the only family with no Irish immigrants. 14 million people have Irish ancestors. Throughout most of the post-war era, when people were worrying about people coming from the Indian subcontinent or from Africa or the Caribbean, the vast majority of migrants came from Ireland, as their ancestors had done to build the railways, before that to build the canals, before that to build the British Army, to supply it with food. It's such a fundamental part of our history that it is, to me, astonishing that it's had to be reclaimed, that it has to be reiterated, and more astonishing still that we don't have a museum to celebrate it, because it is just, as I said, it's so fundamental, it is banal, it is encoded in our language, in our cuisine, in our culture, and as we'll be talking about, in our art.
Lovely. Thank you very much. So much to think about there. Indhu, can I come back to you then? So you say that your proposal for the first season, and no doubt going on from that, is the modern mainstream. So what does the modern mainstream look like?
It's just, I mean, it's the beginning of an idea. It's subject to change.
Okay.
What does it look like? I would say I'd call it a legacy and disruption. So it's honouring where it's an amazing theatre. For those who don't know, the National Theatre sits on the South Bank, and it sits in between, across the river. On one side is St Paul's Cathedral, and on the other side is Westminster. And between church and state, and to me that is a metaphor of the power of theatre and where it sits in our national discourse. So it's about, so the first play, one of the first plays we're doing is Hamlet, and Hamlet was opened in the National Theatre and has a tradition at the National of profiling actors of its generation. And the Hamlet that's going to be in the first season is going to be played by Haran Abisekara, who won the Olivier for The Life of Pi a couple of years ago, and it's about placing him at the centre of one of our Hamlets as one of our leading actors. So it's absolutely his place to be there, but it's representative of the diaspora of this country who has a right to be on the main stage. The first story, so the first play that I'll be directing is it's a Greek tragedy called The Bacchae, and it's about the god of theatre, Dionysus. And again, the person it's a new writer. It's his debut play on the Olivier stage. He's done the adaptation. He's an actor, British-Iranian, and the play, his version of the play is in spoken word and rap, and the language and what he was doing with his friends as a young person. So that's what I mean about the legacy of the theatre, but also spinning it to represent London, our nation now.
So I suppose your challenge is to attract new audiences into the National, which you did very successfully in the Kiln, without potentially alienating people who've always gone to the National and think, well, what's this?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's the theatre's got to be for everyone. It's got to be for the people who love the theatre, who love the National for the past 50 years or 60 years, and those who've never been. How do you open the doors for those who've never been there before?
How are you going to do that? Work in progress.
Work in progress. I mean, Stormzy's doing a project which I think will help open the doors to people who don't normally come to the National.
I think it will. If you don't mind, I'll mention also one of the shows you have on at the moment, the Dear England.
Yes.
Which is a really good example of that. Dear England is a play that's on at the National right now, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, it's well, all right.
And sitting in that audience, what's surprising about it is it's two groups who would not normally, I think it's fair to say, not often meet. It's those who, I mean, there's a broad spectrum of people, but there is a big group who love theatre but don't think they're that interested in football. And then there's a big group who love football but perhaps wouldn't normally come to theatre.
Absolutely.
I think it was the first time the Prime Minister had ever been to the National Theatre, isn't it? Because he loves football. Yeah. So you get this group, and it is a very interesting feeling to be sitting in that audience and understanding that we are, bringing a group together who are just encountering each other, taking it in. By the end of the play, to a woman, to a man, everybody is singing Sweet Caroline together. And if you go, you will, even if you're not a sing-along person, which I am not, I sang it like every time.
Yeah.
So...
And which were you? Were you football or theatre to start with?
Well, I've got a footballing family, but I'm not, I'm not very sporty.
Okay. Indhu, one last question, which is that, people will say the arts are dominated by left-leaning views and that what you're doing, I know I said I'd keep politics out of it, but it is a question, it's a sort of artistic question about the arts. And are you hoping to reflect all sorts of points of view in what you stage?
First of all, I don't agree 100% with it, because I think the power of theatre is in its nuance and it lives in the grey, like it's not black or white. And actually, the best plays are those that provoke questions, that don't give answers. And I've done plays. I've done a play about Margaret Thatcher that at the Tricycle and Kiln felt a very particular audience. The minute we put it in the West End, the audience applauded when Margaret Thatcher came on. And I think an audience will decide, that's good writing. That was Moira Buffini, did a play at the National about called The Father the Assassin, which was about the person who'd assassinated Gandhi. And it was fascinating talking to people. Lots of people thought it was a pro-Gandhian play or an anti-Gandhian play. That's the brilliance of a good writing. It doesn't tell you what to think. So I slightly disagree. I think that's the wrong PR image of theatre. So I absolutely think that I would love the National to be a place where we can hold opposing opinions and be respectful and listen. And we live in a time of incredible identity politics where every identity thinks they're under threat. So how do we get those stories out there and for people to hear and speak to each other? That's what I think is the true definition of a national theatre.
Okay, thank you. Sathnam, you've written, as I said, in every genre. You've written a memoir, you've written a novel, and you've also written history books that are also social commentary. Do you think one style is more effective than the other in terms of getting people's sympathy or understanding?
Yeah, I mean, actually, to echo what Indhu just said, when I've write fiction, the way I make sense of it is that a fiction, even when I read it, is about asking questions. It's about encouraging the reader to ask questions. And in non-fiction, you're providing answers. Although I guess, I'm not an historian. So when I wrote my first history book, whereas a history book not only written by a non-historian, but for people who don't normally read history books. So there's a huge amount of doubt in it, which I think lots of people who do read history books struggle with. But I think we need more of that. And especially when it comes to the question of the British Empire, almost every book on the British Empire comes from an angle. So, think of recent books. We got Neil Ferguson arguing that empire was great. We got Sachi Thoreau arguing that empire was terrible. We got Kwasi Kwarteng actually arguing that empire was terrible, although he doesn't want to talk about that book, really, because it doesn't really fit the party political thing that his party is doing.
To be fair, there's a lot he doesn't talk about.
Indeed. He's just generally gone quite quiet for various reasons. But I thought there was, I think Empire and the success I had with my first book on history has shown there is an appetite for people to really learn about history who are unsure and who are questioning, who, realize that opposite things can be true at the same time. This is an idea that I think could liberate not only our understanding of history, but our understanding of people and ourselves. I mean, once you realize that people can be opposite things at the same time, that your parents can be aggressive and blackmailing, but also loving, it opens up the whole world. And I think it's absolutely the key to understanding history and to understanding some of the most difficult issues in the world at the moment. But the world is going in the opposite direction. Social media, politics, algorithms are all sending us into echo chambers. So we as human beings need to hold on to the idea that contradictions are possible.
Contradictions are possible, and that it's possible to talk about, for example, empire, which is what you've written about, in a non-polarizing way. Is that possible?
I think I've managed it, but obviously the people who send me death threats disagree. I think when it comes to the British Empire, you're dealing, and David knows this, you're dealing with a lot of feeling. So many people come to the subject with, pride or shame. So many people have family connections to the history. Either their parents or their grandparents were involved in the empire on the colonizing side, or they're, like I have my family, they were the colonized. So they arrive with a huge amount of feeling. It's almost the only era of British history where that's true. I mean, we can talk about Henry VIII and Elizabeth I and the Industrial Revolution without saying, oh, I'm really proud of it. I'm ashamed of Henry VIII. We don't do that very often. Or maybe we should, because he was a bit of a bastard. But I think, David's talked about this very articulately. We need to almost remove that feeling. We need to approach this history as history that can be contested.
So you've not played with all these forms. You've written in all these different forms. I want to talk to you a little bit about language and whether you feel that the sort of language that you can use about people, about groups, about periods has changed over time, and if that's changed for the better or for the worse.
Yeah, absolutely. And language is so important. I mean, there's a huge attack happening at the moment on DEI, and it's ideologically driven and cynical. But I do think the DEI space has made some mistakes, and one of the mistakes is that it has focused too much on language and a tendency to condemn people for using the wrong language, when language changes all the time, and we all use the wrong language sometimes. And it changes so quickly. And there's an example between my first book on Empire, Empire Land, and my second book, Empire World. In that time, in those 5 years, the language on slavery has changed. In my first book, I talked about slaves. My second book, I only talked about the enslaved, because quite rarely this is something that happened to people. It wasn't an active choice. And it's quite right that that language changed. But equally, I shouldn't be condemned for once using that word, because that was the language then. And I think we need to be more flexible and liberal and understanding of people when they use the wrong language. And it can stultify conversations and debates around these very tricky issues.
How fascinating that it should have changed so quickly within 5 years.
Yeah, and even now I bet people write on people having a go at me for having used that word 5 years ago. And it's like, well, I didn't know, I've learned. If we as a society lose the ability to allow people to learn, we're not a society.
Ez, can I come to you? So you described for us at the beginning this, to my mind, extraordinary situation where you sat and you looked at a person's face for 45 minutes. And I suppose they looked at you and you didn't speak to each other. Well, I can't imagine doing that really for 10 seconds rather than, what was going through your mind as you were looking at them? What were you seeking to achieve by doing that?
Yeah, and the best way to talk about this, sorry, really forgive me standing up. I've got a sightline thing. I've trained as a set designer, so if people can't see things, I feel like I've done a bad job. So the non-verbal aspect of the project was really critical, I felt. I wanted, what I was seeing around me was something I didn't understand. I didn't understand how, on the one hand, I felt this kind of surge of generosity, openness towards people who are coming from Ukraine. You know, my parents still have people staying in their house who came from Ukraine. Schools are open, trains. You know, we all felt it, right? I grew up in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher. I hadn't felt that porosity in this country in my lifetime. It felt really good, and yet I couldn't rationalise this cognitive dissonance I was feeling between that mode of being and yet this language, as you say, so precisely around invasions on the beaches towards other communities, people coming from Somalia and Sudan and Afghanistan and everywhere else. And I was like, I thought this must be in me. If this is in my city and in my country, it must be in me too, and I need to seek it out and meet it. Otherwise I don't know myself and I can be of no service to this. So I wanted to meet my own unconscious bias, wanted to catch it in action. And so I'll give you actually the example I told you about earlier is probably the best way to describe it. Of the 50 people who came in from 28 different countries, quite early in the process, and I'm not a portrait drawer, it's not what I do all the time. Should have brought some slides, but the portraits I did were rather simple. You know, simple drawings like this in chalk and charcoal, not really to show off particularly much about drawing, but just for me to leave traces of an encounter with someone who had been stranger to me at the beginning and wasn't by the end. And actually this drawing was about the 5th one I'd done. And it's a lady called Maya. And because I haven't done that much portrait drawing, although I've worked with people wearing hijab, I'd never drawn someone wearing hijab. And I wanted to get it right. I was being really careful. I was just carefully drawing this beautiful headscarf, how the light landed on this lady's face. I didn't want to offend. I didn't want to get it wrong. I wanted to do my best. And all sorts of things were going through my mind, listening to the music, looking into her eyes. I was brought up in a Catholic church. So the longest I'd probably ever looked at a lady wearing hijab before was Mary. You know, so that came to my mind. I was like, I must be thinking about that and get on, you know. And of course, after 45 minutes, we paused the drawing. And she told me her story. She said, right, I'm an airline pilot. I took off this morning. I just drove the 737. And of course, I caught myself at it. There, caught red-handed. Why hadn't I thought she was an airline pilot? Why hadn't that thought crossed my mind? And then when I went back to the drawing afterwards, I carried on. And of course, now all my unconscious biases about female airline pilots came on. So I'm drawing her watch. I'm like, this is a pilot's watch. And I'm drawing this watch as this big butch watch. And it's just an iWatch. There's nothing special, that watch. But I caught myself at it again and again. So that's why I did the project, was to meet myself so I could mitigate against the unconscious bias that I'm at about lots of things, including pilots' watches.
Yes. Don't sit down. So this was a task you set yourself, but of course it's for the public to see. And what did you want them to take from it?
I didn't know what I was going to experience, but in my encounters with this group of 50 people, each time another one would enter my room and I sat with them and encountered them, if you sit and look into someone's eyes, sorry, I'm doing it to you now. If you sit and look into someone's eyes for 45 minutes, I defy any of you to do it and not have a pretty transcendent experience, because we don't do it. I discovered a philosopher called Emmanuel Levinas, who wrote an essay in 1961 called Face to Face. And he said the human face ordains and orders us. Its first commandment is thou shalt not kill. And if you do look into someone's face, into someone's eyes for 45 minutes, you sort of come in touch with the whole cosmos. You think, oh, it's all there. That's great. I've seen the secret of everything now. Just that meditation. So I wanted to impart that feeling to those who came, that continuity of self. You know, as Stefano Boeri, the extraordinary architect and philosopher, says, the edge of the human epidermis is a really arbitrary place to consider the edge of self. You know, we are, of course, continuous. The minute I've breathed out this breath that was probably breathed once by a gazillion people, you've breathed it in. We are continuous with one another. So I wanted to invoke that continuity. And also, by the time I'd met this group of people, the resilience I encountered, the extraordinary nature of this particular community of people who all have refugee stamped in their passport, and the amount that I learned from them, how proud was I to be, this was my community. I felt so proud to be counted as a Londoner with this group of people. And I was quite careful in the fragments of each person's story that I chose in this composite story that you heard when you entered the church. At the end of that, you kind of had an I'm Spartacus feeling. You felt a real sense of, I want to be part of this gang. Like, I'm proud to be part of this community. And then most people were crying at the end as well, because they felt an undertow of grief that they didn't always feel this proud. It was that combination
who were
of pride
sitting
and grief.
for you
The audience.
crying. Oh, the audience.
Fusion of pride and grief. Pride to be part of this group, and that this is part of who we call London, this is us. And then grief that you didn't always feel like that, or that it took this work to make you feel like that.
And I suppose, Indhu, that's the power of art, isn't it? That you can understand something intellectually, but feel it as well. It's an emotional experience too.
It's that, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't normally quote the Pope, the Pope who passed away. Not just because of my own background, but I think when he said the most toxic disease of globalization is indifference, it really struck me, because what we do in theatre, in art, is we tell stories and we engage in empathy, because you have to walk in someone else's shoes. Literally, to act, you're walking in someone else's shoes. So that's the power of it, and that's why we need it even more so now.
So, David, you've spent your career telling us all where we have come from. Do you think we now know, or do we need to find out yet more? How educated are people? Because you've been crying from the rooftops. You're making programs. You've been,
I think we're done. Should we have a drink?
Yeah.
I think what's happening in history is that history is running away from two theories that didn't help us. The first is the great man theory, that fundamentally history is a series of biographies of great men, and nothing else really matters. And that, of course, excludes almost everybody else. And the other kind of theory is the idea of, in the British context, of the Ireland story, that Britain's story really is Britain's history is geographically delineated. If it didn't happen within these borders, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really count. And what we mean by those borders is Britain. We don't even mean Ireland. Most people, one of the absences in British education that is most shocking is our relationship with the island, just over the Irish Sea. That is, in some ways, the most shocking thing, the most shocking absence in what we know. So those two ideas, that history is really about great men and history is really about what happens in these islands, that's what's been collapsing. It's been collapsing since the 1960s. And the way it's collapsed, I think, is fascinating and enriching and wonderful, because when historical theories collapse, they collapse because of an expansion, because of the increase in knowledge. Not the reduction of knowledge, not the erasing of history or the rewriting of history, but the fact that we know more. It began really in the 60s with Marxist history that wanted to talk about working class. E.P. Thompson talked about trying to save working class people from the enormous condescension of history. There was women's history, then we had gay history, there was black history, the history of empire. This has just made history more expansive. The example I use is in the 1960s, if you went to a National Trust property, you didn't go to the kitchens. You went to the great staterooms. You went and walked around the manicured gardens. You looked at the art collection. Now the kitchen is fundamentally part of the tour, as are the freezing attic rooms where the maids lived, because our ancestors, we now understand, are much more likely to have been in that kitchen or those attics than in those grand rooms. I think it's the early 20th century, or late 19th century, when for the first time domestic service does not become the number one female occupation. So history's grown, and I think the stories of immigration and emigration are just merely part of that expansion, that we know more about our ancestors. We can see our own ancestors within this thing that we call history much more vividly than we ever could before. And that leads us inevitably to stories of movement and migration, because those very human stories that aren't about great men inevitably involve these amazing stories of movement. And the thing I would say we were getting there if we could get to a point where talking about migration as a historian felt the way it does within my family, as a family that is kind of that is an immigrant family. I was born in Nigeria. I was brought up in the Northeast. I'm a Nigerian Geordie, for God's sake. To be of two cultures is not this kind of stilted, difficult political balancing act. It is a comedy of errors. My father regarded my vegetarianism as a mild form of mental illness. We pretended when I was in Nigeria, when goats appeared in the garden because we were having a feast, we just pretended that nothing had happened to them, and I couldn't piece together what was happening. He tolerated all sorts of things about how culturally British had become. I love the way that my brothers who've moved from Nigeria to Britain have had to make sense of this country that they knew in theory, they knew from film, they knew from books, but they hadn't encountered. That sort of joy in immigrant families of being in this kind of wonderful comedy of errors and these mistakes and these culture clashes and these misunderstandings, when we get to the point when we talk about this as joyous, as enriching, as funny, then I think we'll be where we should be.
And you're a trustee of the Migration Museum, and so obviously a big backer of the new home that it's going to have. And I assume from what you're saying that you would hope that this would be a place where exactly these conversations and this sort of approach can happen, that people can go and feel amongst kindred spirits in a way.
Yeah, I think national stories need a home. They need a sort of front room in which to be enjoyed and expressed and disseminated to generations. I mean, we often forget as we get older that the first people, that museums are where children go. The school trip is fundamental to education and to museums. That when I think about the Migration Museum, I think about children in the most diverse city in Europe having this wonderful facility. I think about that amazing class photo project that Steve McQueen did a few years ago that was really, for anybody who didn't really fully get this city, that was the wake-up call. Look at those children. Look at that, I can't remember which year it was, but that was, you can follow that year through and work out where they're going to be when they can vote. You can work out where they're going to be when they enter the job market. That is us. You want to see the future, go to an infant school. That is the Britain we're going to be becoming, and we just need a facility in which not just to learn that history, but to celebrate it. And I think often with these histories of empire or migration, that I think we forget that for most people, their reaction to these histories is not a politicized one. It's just one that is very similar to our general reaction to history. We like stuff that's interesting and new. Mm-hmm. We love fascinating details that enrich our world. I mean, I love telling audiences, one of my specialisms is the First World War. One of the great words that emerged from the First World War is the word blighty. Patriotic, affectionate diminutive for Britain. And I think we've imagined that it comes out of the First World War because it came out of the language of the Tommies. It absolutely came out of the trenches, but it came out of the trenches because within those trenches in 1914 and 15 were 150,000 Indian soldiers who took the Hindu word violati, already corrupted into this word blighty in British India, took it into the trenches, and it was their spread to the British soldiers who came home, and this word made its way into the language and to the magazines and the postcards and the songs of the First World War. This Hindi word, a corruption of a Hindi word, used to describe this affection we have for these islands, when it was actually an external view of these islands from people thrown from India into the chaos of the Western Front. Most people's reaction to that is no, it's not that I've lost the word blighty because it's a woke, terrible foreign word, but isn't that fascinating? Most people's reaction to history and historical expansion and new information is not anger or guilt or frustration. It is just pure fascination, because we in this country are very, very lucky to be fascinated by history. The National Trust I mentioned a moment ago is the biggest mass membership organization in Europe. 5.7 million members, on 5.8 now. got to remember that despite what you might see if you're crazy enough to go on Twitter, most people's reaction to these stories is just fascination.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good moment at which to open this up to the floor and get some questions. Yes, there's a gentleman here at the beginning. There's a microphone coming to you. And anybody else so that I can line you up?
David, my name is Arif Zanan. David, in your statistic, your takeaway statistic of 1815 to 1914, there'll doubtless be some of those people from Croydon that had links to the East India Company that went out. 100 years ago, there were people from Lahore and Bangalore who came to these islands for education 100 years ago, including my grandparents. Now, my question is simply this, and this is something the Migration Museum does very well. What more do you think we can do to unravel and unpick the unfamiliar and the unknown in our migration story, especially right now, against a narrative that probably isn't conducive towards it?
Yeah. I think one of the things we need to do is we need to decouple the idea of migration of being a post-war phenomenon. In the study of Black history, we call this the Windrush myth. There is no question that the immigration that took place in Britain after 1945 was of a different scale and different order to that which had taken place before. But there was still mass migration. There was still mass movement, both ways. The story of Ireland here is absolutely fundamental, because if we include Ireland as the first colony and Britain's relationship with Ireland as the first imperial relationship, then that idea that mass migration is a post-45 phenomena begins to collapse. But there's many different forms of migration. People came because they had specialist skills and they knew they could make a living. People came, as you said, for education. If you look at the censuses when they emerged in the middle of the 19th century and you look at schools and colleges, there will be Africans from Sierra Leone, there will be Indians, the sons of Maharajas and Sultans. You will see, if you go to the port towns of Bristol, Liverpool, Cardiff, of course London, you will see the maritime world. Any point in the story of the 19th century is hundreds of thousands of men at sea. They are this incredible diaspora. And as much as those ships are diverse, so are those port towns. We have these other stories of different sorts of people, different sorts of communities that are very different to the post-45 story. What a great place to tell that is the story of Liverpool. Liverpool is not like many other cities, but Liverpool's Black community is both African and Caribbean. I have a Scouser colleague who is ostensibly, you'd say she was Black, but her ancestors are both Caribbean and African, and they've been in Liverpool for 5 generations, long before 48. So we need to get away from the Windrush myth. And I'll go back to my other point. We also need to just remember that this is fascinating. These people are they just enrich our story. The great danger of the politicization of this history is that somehow, and it does go back to 68 and what happened in Wolverhampton, somehow many people have been convinced that my story is a threat to your story rather than part of your story. This idea that this is an external narrative, an alien story somehow imposed upon us rather than a fundamental part of our story, that is what we need to reject. And we need to remember that most people, I think, are open-minded to wanting to know more about everybody's history. We have to remember genealogy is one of the most, it's an explosion of participatory history. History used to be done by historians. Now history is done by anybody with an internet and a Find My Past login. It is participatory. It's something that we all share. And I love it when I meet people who've encountered these stories of movement and migration unexpectedly in their family histories. Fine, they do. Sorry, I hadn't said that, so I forgot.
I agree. And
other genealogy sites are available.
But in connection to that, I think we lose out that this is separate history. I think we can carry on talking about our national stories, World War I, World War II, the Tudors, and there's migrant elements to all those stories. Elizabeth I was complaining about there being too many Black people in London in 1600. There was a Black trumpeter, I think, in Henry VII's court. And the empire element of both World War I and World War II. I mean, I was taught all these things, but I was never taught about those really interesting elements of our national stories.
But interesting is the key word.
Right, we've got lots of questions now suddenly. So, gentleman over here first, and then there are two here. Anyone from the back? And a gentleman there. Right, if we can whiz through them, because we're running out of time, everyone's getting thirsty. Yes, go.
Just to say thank you very much. I used to shout at the television a lot, and now I get shouted at on television for speaking up about migration on GB News. And you've given us such a warm glow of appreciation for migration. Without getting into too much politics, but can we redeem this idea of migration? Is net migration has become the great hammer to hit this government or previous governments. What's the way forward? How do we re-narrate migration not as a threat to our national well-being? I guess I'm looking at the artists among us for some advice.
Indhu and Ez.
You go first.
You go first. Oh, simple question.
How do we mitigate against this? I think through everything we've been talking about, we need to help audiences to understand that it's continuous with them and not separate from them, effectively. I think the point that has been made about language, that story about Blighty is so beautiful. I'd not heard that before. When I was at university, I studied English literature, and I had a teacher who went through every line in Henry II, Shakespeare's play, explaining where every single word had come from, whether it had come from the Saxon or from the French. So I learnt pretty early that every single word we speak, I became obsessed with etymology. And I now, when I use a word and I feel a bit fishy about a word, like I just don't love the word for some reason, I'm quick to the etymology. I want, where did the word come from? And you quickly get taken back to Proto-Indo-European roots of things, and you understand, you know, that all of our language has all travelled from an area of the Balkans because they had horses and wheels and they got their language to more places, right? I think you concur, probably that's the history of it. But to understand that this is threaded thrillingly in our language, in our gesture, in our bones, in every part of us, to make, I think the big answer to your question is help people feel continuous with this story. I don't know what you would say to it.
I think it's also, I think part of the problem is when it becomes reductive or simplified, or we become stereotypes and I think what we're all fighting for, or what we all want, is the complexity to be expressed, and that we're multiple aspects of any of us, and we also want the right to the main stage. As we don't want to be marginalised literally in the small studio. I'm using theatre as an analogy. That we are all entitled to be heard in all our complexities, in all our contradictions, and I think that's what we need to fight for.
Thank you. The two gentlemen here, I'm going to take you at the same time, and then we'll have one back there, and then we'll have a drink. So where are the... There we go. Yes, microphone's coming to you. Yes.
Hello, and thank you so much for today. It just seems to me that migration continually gets mixed up with racism. And I grew up here, I was born here, and during the 70s it was terrible. And I was at school, as we've all experienced, Sathnam mentioned it. And that improved a hell of a lot, and particularly in the Blair years, I think, However, since Brexit, I feel that's just gone back many, many years. I just wonder how we break that link between migration and racism. And I'm not talking particularly about the people in this room. I'm talking about the wider populace who, see this every day in the Daily Mail, the Express, whatever it might be, who are, how do we break that link permanently and move forward is my question.
Thank you very much. And would you pass the microphone to the gentleman next to you, and we'll take them together?
Yeah, thank you. My question is about culture. I wonder whether you think there's still pressure on immigrants and their descendants to talk about that part of the story and not just them as human beings.
Indhu, why do you take them both?
I think the argument I talk about is we have equality when we're all allowed to be artists. We're not having to be representative or take a political stance, or, it's all talk. When we're allowed to be pure artists and not be representational. So that's the fight. That's the end goal of that. We don't have to carry everything with us. We can talk about what we want to talk about. Is it happening? I think yes. I mean, I think we've got a way to go, but I think we keep getting, yes, I do think we're pushing into that.
And Sathnam, this gentleman's question about migration and racism.
I would say to you, there's a separation between what British people think and believe and the media narrative. If you actually look at attitudes towards migrants, since Brexit, they've improved significantly. People are more tolerant and appreciative of migrants than ever. But you would never believe that because the media is, and I say that as a journalist, is obsessed with, and politicians are as well. So we have a very skewed understanding of what British people actually think. And I think the answer, at the risk of saying something positive, is that answer is to have interactions with migrants and to see people as human beings. And that is why I think attitudes are changing, because increasingly people are meeting people from all around the world and meeting migrants, and they're seeing them as human beings.
And one question there, and then a final one from the lady here. Yes, please.
Hello, I'm David Henke, a freelance journalist, but I am also an amalgam of ancestry in the sense that my forebears came from Germany, Holland, Norway, and Lithuania, and later South Africa. And to add to this mix, my grandchildren are half British and half Iraqi Kurdish as well. My question to the panel would be, what are their views that the new Migration Museum should promote the fusion of more cultures within families and things? Because I think this is quite a big thing. I noticed from my connection with Kurdish families that some Kurdish taxi drivers were marrying Polish Catholics, and that is quite a combination. And I think one of the things the museum could do is promote how wide actually the culture is in this country, and I think it's a wonderful thing.
Hi, I'm also a journalist. I'm a bit, I suppose, unsettled by the very interesting discussion I've heard, because it seems to me that there is a genuine, absolute and very big threat to the sort of things all of you are describing and striving for. When our present Prime Minister has said some of the things he said about empire and about migration, and we've got an almost organised, if you like, push. And partly you covered this in your question when you said about, will the right be able to feel comfortable at the National Theatre and so on. I wonder if what you're all trying to do will be affected by what I sense as a journalist. I've written 3 columns in the last 2 weeks on this, that the mood has so shifted from where we were during the Olympics, for example. And as with America, without even knowing it, and sometimes knowing it, journalism, the arts, kind of succumbs to it.
Okay, Yasmin, thank you. I think to a certain extent, David, you made a statement rather than asking a question. I think that was really interesting, and I think everybody would probably take that on board. David, the answer to Yasmin, the overall political climate, is that going to affect what people do, or do you just plough on regardless?
Well, first of all, hello, Yasmin. Nice to see you. It is very difficult to not look at what's happening in recent months and recent days and remain unmoved by it. in the sense that Sathnam talked about, and there are no shortage of statistics that show that attitudinally, Britain is an astonishingly successful story of successful migration and integration. When I look at the statistics of the country I grew up in the 80s, it's terrifying. Opposition as the child of an interracial marriage, opposition to my parents' marriage and my existence was over 50% when I came to Britain, when I was a child in this country. We have changed astonishingly. And yet, to go back to 68 and Wolverhampton, that narrative that the presence of non-white people, the presence of migrant communities is a threat to Britain and British identities, that seed that was sown in Wolverhampton in 68 keeps flowering, it keeps going. What truly shocks me is, and I read about this in one of my books, is if you look at actually what happened hour by hour, in the days after the Rivers of Blood speech, is that cancer of racism was surgically removed from the Conservative Party by its leadership in a way that disturbingly and terrifyingly does not happen today. There are people who have said things in recent months that are comparable to what was said in 68 who hold their posts. There are statements in manifestos that I remember being on the posters of the National Front when I was a child. Attitudinally, this country, I think, is made progress that I wouldn't have dreamed of when I was being attacked by that National Front in the 1980s. Politically, and in terms of what I read in newspapers and what politicians feel able to say, it feels that we have gone backwards. There is this disconnect, this mismatch, as Sathnam said, between what you read, if you're crazy enough to go online, and what you see on the streets. And as we all know, opposition to migration is strongest where the migrants were fewest. It is an idea. It is a threat that has been weaponized and is now metastasized. I think it was born in 68, but I think it's stronger now than it's ever been at any point since my youth.
I guess if there's something I find really reassuring is that if you look back at Wolverhampton, exactly 100 years before Enoch Powell, the same things were being said about the Irish. Exactly. They practice a weird religion. They don't speak the language. They don't integrate. They live in slums. They create slums. They do shitty jobs. They smell. Almost word for word what was happening in 1968. In a weird way, that makes me feel a bit better because I feel like there's something cyclical about this or something just back in human nature that makes people think this. And maybe in a weird way, we can recognize the pattern.
Which is right to reflect on the gentleman's question earlier. Part of the story of breaking the idea that migration is a story of race is to remember our relationship. The English invaded Ireland in 1165. There's a 900-year colonial history. 14 million people in the United Kingdom have Irish ancestors. We need to also remember that story because it's fundamental in breaking that link that this is a racial story. Those 14 million people with Irish ancestors, many of whom have been rather grateful for those ancestors when it comes to passports after a bad decision we made a few years ago. They're immigrants as well. And that expansion of who is an immigrant, we talk about visible minorities and invisible minorities. More and more people being proud of their migrant ancestors, I think is key to countering the politicization of this debate that has reached such a disturbing point this week and this year and today.
I'm going to draw it to a close. It would have been nice to draw it to a close on a higher note than that. But we are being realistic. We're being realistic about where we are. I think you can agree it's been a fascinating debate. 4 wonderful speakers, Indhu, Sathnam and David. Thank you very much.